And he's, of course, talking about the situation over certainly in the Far East, where, of course, China's making demands for sovereignty over a series of islands there. And they want these islands because there's massive oil and natural gas resources adjacent to them. And suddenly China is beginning to tell American and Japanese airlines, and suddenly everybody else, you can't come into our area, and if the planes are going to come into our area, we have to be notified ahead of time. And initially we told the Japanese not to go along with it, but then, of course, when it involved our planes, we simply knuckled under, and as Joel is pointing out, we've simply given in to all of the Chinese communist commands as they simply tell us what to do, and we obediently do it. Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, as I said, the New York Times saw this as hypocrisy on the U.S. part, getting Japan to stop their airlines from complying, for the fear that it would add legitimacy to Chinese claims to control the airspace above islands claimed by both countries. And it does indeed add legitimacy to China's claims. China's newly declared air defense zone, experts say, is designated mainly to whittle away at Japan's hold on the islands, which it has long administered. Well, the Biden visit was an embarrassment to U.S. prestige. Biden told American business leaders he had been, quote, very direct, but that's not how I read his milquetoast expressions of, quote, concern to China. In the Chinese capital Thursday, USA Today wrote, Biden told American business leaders he had been very direct in telling President Xi Jinping about the U.S. government's objections to a zone that had also angered Japan. Biden's first stop on his three-nation week-long tour. China's recent and sudden announcement of new air defense zone has, to state the obvious, caused significant apprehension in the region, Biden said. Well, I didn't tell anything to China about, stopping this. He actually turns around and justifies China by telling the businessmen, as China's economic concerns grow, its stake in regional security also rises. That's why China will bear increasing responsibility to contribute positively to peace and security. Well, this is diplomatic language that clearly sends a message to China that the U.S. intends to do nothing to contest their power grab, but merely encourages China to act positively about security. Notice that he couches his responsibility words in positive terms rather than say that they would bear responsibility for any conflicts that arise.
Hold that thought. We'll be back in just a moment here.
Well, as I said, there's only one way to put the Chinese in their place, and that's to say, we will not allow you to threaten or make demands on any aircraft flying through international airspace, and we will have aircraft on patrol to make sure that you do not use force. Now, that's a message the Chinese would understand, but the U.S. has no intention of sending such a message or in any other way deterring China's creeping hegemony. In fact, it serves U.S. globalists more to force the world to become accustomed to Chinese threats. Here's the Chinese game plan. And this is from the New York Times again. China's state-run media Thursday repeated arguments that blame Japan, not China. The current tension in the East China Sea, said Chinese media sources, is stirred up by Japan to win pity. Chinese analysts have said that the new air zone is primarily aimed at forcing Japan to begin negotiations over a group of uninhabited islands next to Japan in the 19th century. Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan are located along the East China Sea, as is the eastern coast of China. The sea contains vast fishing resources and is estimated to have untapped oil and natural gas reserves. China says it all belongs to them. Well, Teresa Moore Hamilton had the more scathing rebuke this week when she said, of course, the U.S. has already seemingly capitulated to China by telling American airlines and others to submit and comply with the so-called Chinese airspace demands. In essence, hanging our allies, Japan and South Korea, out to dry and at the mercy of the Chinese communists. It's a complete turnaround from Obama's previous stance on supporting Japan on this issue. The weaknesses and now capitulation to China is drawing strong rebuke from leaders. This is James Inhofe, a Republican of Oklahoma. In an obvious attempt to placate China, he wrote, the United States is sacrificing the assurance to our allies in the region that we are a reliable and steadfast security partner. Once the U.S. allows China to get away with this, it sets a precedent that she cannot intervene later to stop without appearing hypocritical. Why now, when you all but encouraged everyone to comply earlier? I expect the next step is for China to declare an air defense zone above the South China Sea as well, which will then affect Vietnam and the Philippines. There's no way this is going to remain static. China will continue to creep onward until she gobbles it all up, and the U.S. is going to let her.
But don't you think that, of course, part of this is going to be to encourage Japan to begin rearming again in preparation for a coming war in that area?
Well, Japan already is rearming to a certain extent. She sees the handwriting on the wall. She is, of course, relying heavily on U.S. protection. She's no match for Japan alone, especially since she's got defensive weapons only. Her constitution doesn't allow any offensive weapons. Of course, it's the thing that didn't allow Germany either after World War II, but they did anyway. But China's kind of complying with it because of extreme economic difficulties and budget difficulties. But I think what's going to happen is not that China or Japan will really get armed for this war. I think Japan is being set up for a Chinese occupation someday. I think China, when World War III starts, will gobble up Japan all the way down through the Philippines and even Australia, who Japan has already bought up most of the natural resources in Australia. I see this stand as an extension of the globalist objective of wanting World War III. That's why they continue to placate Japan, play like that she's an ally, and they can go on forever. No matter how threatening China gets, they played this with Russia all during the Soviet years. They said, well, we can placate Russia. We can cause it to be friendly by giving in more, and let's give aid and trade to Russia and show her that she has nothing to fear from the West. They can play this game all day long, and everybody buys it. In the news media, they keep propagandizing the American people. But eventually they want a third world war, an attack on America, especially on America's military. And then our leaders can come out of their bunkers and force all of us to accept a military new world order, a militarized global government to prosecute the war. And I think that's what they're up to.
I wouldn't be at all surprised, there's no question at all, that this is all being manipulated, and the average American has very little understanding of what's going on, that there really are people who control our government whose loyalty is not to America, but to this globalist movement, this one world government, and they know they'll never get the American people to go for it unless we have a third world war. And I agree with you, it's not a matter of if, but when. And until the people understand the subversive element that dominates both political parties, makes mockery of our electoral process, nothing is going to change. Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, there's another related story as well on Russia's pressuring the Ukraine to not make a deal with the EU. They desperately want Ukraine to stay out of the EU. They have actually, encouraged a lot of the old Soviet states to get into the EU and act as spies. They've got plenty of them in there now. But they want to make sure that Belarus, Georgia, and Ukraine, which are the main countries between Russia and Europe, are there as potential staging grounds for their weapons system before World War III. Now, as you remember, Ukraine not only is the wheat belt of all of Eastern Europe, produces most of the grain that supplies Russia and also allows them to have some export. But it also is the key to military bases in the Black Sea. That's where all of the major naval forces were in Russia, because Russia doesn't have a clear access to the ocean except through the Arctic, and that's frozen over much of the year, and the part that isn't has to come out through the narrow channels between Copenhagen and Sweden, and there they can be interdicted by allies. So Russia really depends on having warm water ports in the Black Sea, and that's why they've maintained their control over the Ukraine. But this week there are huge demonstrations going on in Kiev, Ukraine, as pro-EU citizens, which constitute almost 48% of the electorate there, complain about pro-Moscow Prime Minister Yanukovych refusing to sign a key trade agreement with the EU. The demonstration, which created a vast sea of yellow and blue Ukrainian and European Union flags across the square, follows Mr. Yanukovych's unexpected decision not to sign a key trade. He alleges that he was pressured not to do so by Russia, which wants Ukraine to sign a customs treaty with Moscow instead. We now find out through other sources that they offered them billions and billions of rubles in aid, which the EU had no money to give, and so it was more of a bribe than anything else. There were also threats. The Kremlin was pressured Mr. Yanukovych into blocking by threatening to cut off supplies of cheap gas, natural gas. This has been a recurring threat to the Ukraine. The former government of Prime Minister, Timovich, and she's in prison right now because of her opposition to this government. But Yanukovych is a pro-Moscow front for Russia, and that's what's happening there. So I don't expect Ukrainians ever to be free. They have a problem just like the Baltics in that the Russians have moved in during the Soviet years millions of other Russians who occupy up to a third of the population in eastern Ukraine, as they did in Belarus and in the Baltic states. And those Russians will provide the conflict fodder to make sure that these states never leave the continuing Soviet Republic.
Okay, certainly I concur. Go right ahead.
Well, the other story that I'm talking about this week is NSA spying. It just keeps growing. Not only is the NSA not stopping its spying, it keeps expanding it. The Washington Post dribbled out another iteration of Ed Snowden's leaks this week, but its only commentary and justification was added to it. Nowhere does the Post utter a hint of outrage, nor is there any call to stop the spying. The Post reported that the NSA is tracking hundreds of millions of cell phones all around the world and storing nearly 5 billion records every day about the user's locations.
5 billion records. I saw that statistic today. 5 billion records of cell phone use every single day. And basically it's amazing sort of what we have in the way of technology, but this certainly has nothing to do with terrorism. They want to be able to track everyone just as they want to be able to control everything we buy, everything we do, and know everything we're thinking or talking about. Go right ahead.
And the only purpose of that is they're building lists of dissidents. They want to know who the people are that are going to object to the New World Order, and that's the main purpose of this spying. As we have talked about many times before, terrorism is merely the false flag operation that justifies all this intervention. The U.S. has been completely responsible for the 9/11 attacks, both of the World Trade Center attacks, the Oklahoma City bombing. All of those things are government false flag operations. Government operations from beginning to end, I outlined in much of my writings in the brief, the evidence behind that, which is very powerful and very strong, especially about 9/11. I don't know how the Post can claim with a straight face that they're not collecting the content of the calls. They keep putting forth the disinformation